department as a postdoc fellow in 2019 and joined my research program, and it's been really very great having her in the department, in my program. So she's brought her considerable skills in critical thinking, but also her commitment to social justice, to bear on some of the issues that we are dealing with in my research program around land, environment, and sustainability, but in this case in a semi-arid region, Peru region. So it's been very interesting having her inputs around water and also the notion of scarcity in a region that and how scarcity is not simply a natural phenomenon, but is also socially produced, and how we think about that in relation to a region where water is an issue, and that has also been struggling with this very severe drought. And currently she's looking at surplus populations, the historical and current production of surplus populations in a context of extractivism in the Prieska area of the Northern Cape, which has a long history of asbestos mining, as many of you know, but also copper mining, and currently now is becoming a renewable energy hub. And also, because it's on the banks of the Harriet River, is a center of irrigated farming, commercial farming in the Northern Cape. So then Bram Buscher, as people will know, a prominent publicly engaged scholar and a prolific writer in the field of political ecology, and he's been particularly active in debates on the limits of conventional conservation approaches in a time of crisis, so climate crisis, but also a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, and the commodification of nature within those intersections. And as I indicated, he's currently professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change group at Wageningen University. He's been there since 2016 and previously was at ISS. And I just want to mention two recent books that came out in 2020. I don't think there's a 2021 book, Bram, but maybe there is. But in December 2020, The Truth About Nature, Environmentalism in the Era of Post-Truth Politics and Platform Capitalism, University of California Press, and then earlier in 2020, so I did say he's prolific, The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene, which he produced with Rob Fletcher. And of course, there's much more that can be said, but let me introduce Stephen, who is somebody who does not need any introduction, as the cliche goes. But Stephen is another prolific author and also a public intellectual, who's been working on a range of issues in which social justice and popular mobilizations around it has been a constant theme, whether with land, HIV/AIDS, sanitation, and water. And he has written several really influential, I think, and important articles on Day Zero in Cape Town and the politics around water and water redistribution and water injustice in our city. And increasingly, I think this is correct to say, Stephen, you become more and more concerned about the climate crisis and what that means for society and for the environment, and how to bring that critical consciousness that you have, and thinking particularly around social movements around these issues as well, which is a really important set of issues that you're dealing with there. And I just want to mention his 2016 book, Letters of Stone. I can't go into it, but if you haven't read it, it's a really important and haunting read. So we have a great panel. And as I indicated, it will be Michela first, then Bram, and then Stephen. So thank you. Michela.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you to the panelists, and I also want to thank the people that are attending online, especially some friends from, well, I see Johannesburg, but also other places. So thank you so much for being here. Right. So what I'm going to do is to give a sense of the book. I suppose there are many ways to present it, but well, this is one of those, I suppose. And I'm just going to show you some pictures, right, as I do that. And I'm going to read. So this is a book on the crisis of inequality in contemporary South Africa, seen and told through one of its most striking manifestations, which is access to water. I think it is important to start my talk by situating water access in its historical context, and especially that of the post-apartheid years, to signal the many continuities between 1995, when the pamphlet on the left-hand side of the screen was published, and 2021, when the picture on the right-hand side was taken. In other words, water access continues to be an unresolved issue in this country. We might actually say it is a crisis in itself. How to qualify this crisis, though? For me, it is first and foremost about the fact that access is still structurally unequal and racialized. And this translates into a great many ordinary water crises, similar to and yet different from Day Zero in Cape Town, which are affecting especially smaller rural towns. It is clearly also a matter of broken promises on the part of the ANC, and not only for reasons of incompetence, right, but rather for the water politics that the governing party decided to pursue. And in fact, water poverty and poor water service delivery regularly re-emerge as topical issues at each election, which is what the two pictures actually refer to. So the one in the middle was taken in the village of Kraipan in the northwest before the national elections of 2019, and it appeared in the Mail and Guardian. And the right one was taken in Fungulelweni, sorry for my bad pronunciation here, in the Eastern Cape, just before the local elections earlier this month, and it appeared in the Daily Maverick. I would like you to focus your attention on the bucket that you see here as the material symbol of the continuity I was talking about earlier. Now, the water crisis also reveals a paradox for me, that inequality has persisted, if not increased, despite a water reform parallel to land reform, which is explicitly committed to reducing inequality. And yet, I think there is more. The paradox has also to do with the legitimization, naturalization even, as the title of the book suggests, of these inequality. In one sense, many of us probably tend to look at these pictures and find them somewhat normal. So how do I understand this inequality paradox in the book? I consider water governance in relation to three broader issues: neoliberalism, race, and the environment. And I look at how these relations play out in one particular context, the Waterberg Plateau of Limpopo province. And here you have a map. Now, this might look like a marginal rural space, but in fact, it is quite central to the country's political economy. And again, for people who were at the Karoo conference last week, to the Minerals Energy Complex, the MEC. In fact, for those who don't know, this is the district where Medupi Power Station is located. So let me say something about these three relations, starting with water and neoliberalism. This is, of course, something that has received a lot of attention in the literature, especially in relation to water services or access to drinking water and its commodification. In the book, however, I also speak of a neoliberal biopolitics of water to explain why water resources are preferentially allocated to production vis-à-vis biological and social reproduction. This is so because production and hence economic growth are considered the best way to enhance life and reduce inequality, in fact. In other words, instead of directly improving water access for poor people by providing more individual taps, for instance, which is what most of them want and keep asking for. In fact, their absence does have a profound impact on their everyday life. Water allocation must contribute to further economic growth and job creation so that people can have more income at their disposal to spend on things that are necessary to sustain life, such as water. As a result, those groups that use water productively, such as commercial farmers, but also mining and energy companies, tend to benefit from much more secure water access. The state actually and also makes water available to them if need be, as I show in the book in regard to Medupi Power Station. And also, and importantly, they tend to be shielded from redistribution as part of the water reform, even in cases of extreme inequality in the distribution of water, like what happens in the Waterberg. It is not all about growth, though. And here I want to move to the second relation, that between water and race. Looking at the Waterberg through the lens of water illuminates a particular politics of place enacted by most of its white residents, reproducing the plateau as a white space, something that inevitably echoes the Group Errors Act and the policy of forced removals under apartheid. This politics of place is based on white people's exclusive control of land water. I treat them as a nexus in the book, and is carried out on both a material and discursive level. On the one hand, white landowners have been evicting more and more black people from their farms, thus prompting a process of urbanization in the small towns of the region, and especially in Waterberg, which lies in the middle of the plateau. And here you can see a few pictures taken in the town, also related to water, of course. Urbanization, in turn, has increased the demand for water services, which, however, cannot be met because white landowners still control all local water resources. As a result, water shortages in Waterberg have become the norm, the ordinary water crisis to which I alluded before, making living conditions more difficult, if not harsh, especially for black township residents. On the other hand, white landowners are adamant that they're not responsible for the water crisis in the town. In fact, they claim that the space of the white farm and that of the now black town are fundamentally distinct, even though what a water perspective does is precisely to show the connections among these spaces. For instance, by looking at how the urban water supply works. Now, in the book, I use David Hugh's idea of other disregarding to explain how whiteness as a symbol and structure of power is enacted by most, if not all, white local landowners through keeping and even strengthening their private control over water and being fundamentally opposed to the very idea of sharing this basic resource, while at the same time ignoring the water-related problems experienced by black local people. But there is more. I also use Jennifer Wenzel's notion of unimagining to argue that black people on the plateau are largely rendered unimaginable. What are they doing here now that their labor on the farms has become superfluous? And why should they be entitled to receive more water if they're not working for it anymore? There is also another important way in which black people are unimagined on the plateau, and that has to do with a third relation that I want to speak about, that between water and the environment, which actually I need to qualify as environmentalism and private nature conservation, a major land use change on the plateau. White landowners turned conservationist, as I refer to them, are producing, again, materially and discursively, the Waterberg as a spectacular wilderness, thus reproducing a colonial imagery of unpeople felt. From this perspective, then, the very presence of black, urban, poor people becomes contested because it does not fit the representation of the landscape conservationists have in mind and try to sell through the local ecotourism industry. and which you can see in these pictures. Also, the water demands of the black urban poor all of a sudden become unsustainable. I just want to make a final point on sustainability before concluding, actually without a conclusion, as this is just the beginning of our conversation. Private nature conservation, as nature conservation in general, I would say, is usually hailed for its sustainable use of water resources, especially in relation, or better, opposition to irrigation farming. In the book, however, I question these assumptions by showing that private game farms and nature reserves in the water an equal distribution of resources on the plateau, again, something which they fail to recognize, let alone rectify. And I think I will stop there. I didn't want to, suppose you have all seen by now the cover of the book, but maybe the content is also is useful. So I leave it there if that's all right. And thank you.
Well, we're going to be focusing on Bram first.
Yes.
So, Bram, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay. So, Bram, let's go straight away to you for your input to the panel discussion, your preliminary input.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much, Cheryl, for organizing this. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And thanks first and foremost to Michela for this wonderful book. I mean, I have it right here, and again, my apologies that I can't be there with you in person. It is something really to celebrate. I'm incredibly excited. You still need to sign my copy for me, Michela, so I'm counting on that. But it is a wonderful achievement. So I want to add my congratulations, but also say a couple of more substantive elements, perhaps in relation to the import of the book, and then perhaps ask a couple of questions or open up several points for discussion. So first and foremost, I just want to emphasize and reiterate what a true pleasure it is to see the book and to read the book. I mean, I have been part of the research trajectory, as Cheryl mentioned, and I witnessed the struggles, up and close, both, in your small little shed or flat or whatever it was in the Waterberg, where you spent countless hours for your research, but also your travels and the time in the Netherlands, etc. And I saw the project slowly coming together. And this is how a PhD, in its ideal form, I think, can be, right? Like a lot of struggle happening, but it's coming together and gaining more and more focus over time. And that was the PhD, right? And now there's this remarkable book. And I mean, just going through it again, I think it's, it's very clear. It's very, very readable. It's beautifully illustrated and laid out, and the production overall it's just amazing. So I think it has actually gained more depth. And I checked this while shedding about 40 pages of text from your original PhD. And this is what maturation does, right? The more mature scholar can say so much more in less pages. And I think that's a real accomplishment. Second, I also want to emphasize what I read now again, but what I remembered very well as well, is your continued astonishment of how and why inequalities continue to be this large and this stark, right? As you say, it's almost a norm. It seems normal, just the way that things are. But obviously they are not normal, right? They have a history and they've been put into place and like that. And this is precisely the argument that you're making, that you're allowing us to see very clearly again, but also because you lay it out so clearly, you make it clear, I think, to me, to all of us, that we should be outraged about all of this, that we should be angry about this, that this is unacceptable, right? These kind of inequalities and how they are naturalized and legitimated. And your book shows this, and I think, I mean, the import of that, you know, cannot be overstated. And thirdly, the centrality of water in all of this. I want to emphasize, you know, again, the importance of this. You call it the essential to life resource, right? That literally, you know, most of us that are in privileged positions often do not think about until it's no longer there, right? As you literally emphasize in your very interesting notes on reflexivity in the introduction that you end the introduction with. So it's good to pause for a second to really think about that, right? I mean, what happens when people don't have water, don't get water? I mean, so in Cape Town, as we just heard, you know, from Cheryl, and I see my image is frozen, but I hope you can all still hear me. Michela?
We can hear you on our side. I think it's the room itself that's cut out. I'll message Matthew and try to get them back.
All right. Good. I will continue under the assumption that they will still hear me, but it seems that that their image is frozen. Anyway, I was stressing, you know, that water is absolutely key in all this, and as Cheryl also mentioned, right, in Cape Town, this issue has been all too real, right? Led to major debates that Stephen, you know, may also say more about still. I can see all of you moving again. Michele, can you hear me? Did you hear me? Well, I don't hear anybody, but I hope that that others still can. You know, I wanted to stress that in relation to Cape Town, right? The crisis was there, it was very hectic, debated, and then also somehow, at least the last half year that I've been here, gone again, right? The dams are full, etc., and so the debate has died down, even though they have longer impacts, obviously. But I think the point that I want to make here in relation to your book is that there are people in the Waterberg who don't have that privilege, right? There are many people in many parts of the country, of the continent, and around the world that do not, you know, have the privilege or the ability to just leave this behind, right? This lack and the potential lack of water is there every day. So your book, you know, highlights that, and I think that that's critically important. I can see you now again, Michela. I hope I was still audible throughout or not, because I can't hear you. But
unfortunately, we have missed some of what you were saying here. I'm hoping that the other.
It seems like online people were able to hear, but you guys keep falling away. You keep being interrupted. Matthew?
It's a panel.
Okay, that should be fine, Cheryl.
Okay, we seem to be on now.
Okay,
Ron, can
yeah,
you hear?
I can hear you now.
So maybe just a quick synopsis for our benefit of what you were saying when you started talking about the centrality of water.
Yes, in literally 1 second. I mean, so what I was stressing that, of course, we have had big debates in Cape Town. Right, I was here 2017 during the water crisis, and what struck me now being back here for half a year is that a lot of that debate, of course, has died down. People are, you know, just happy that the dams are full and all that. But I wanted to stress that a lot of people in other parts of the country do not have that luxury, right? Do not have that privilege. A lot of people still live with the anxiety of not having water on a daily basis. And again, this is something that Michela's book shines the spotlight on, and how this lack is embedded in broader structures of political economic power. So that we, never forget that this is an uneven, structurally uneven, form of distribution that is critical to highlight, to understand, but also to confront. So I have 3 points for those are my part of my congratulations, Michela, and just highlighting why the book is so important. So I wanted to highlight 3 points for discussion. That was a bit tricky, obviously, because I mean, also going through some of my own old notes, we have discussed this quite extensively in so many ways. So I was also trying to push myself to come up with some newer and other issues. And I think I have 3 points that we may not have talked about before in the same way. So I'd be keen to hear your view about this, and they may also be parts of a broader discussion that we may have with others. The first is in relation to your point about the Waterberg being a marginal space. So you mentioned this in your talk just now, but you also mentioned this in your introduction again, right? That sort of like it's a marginal space, and then you say, well, actually, it's not. And you kind of then leave that as it is, right? It sort of comes back, but I was actually wondering whether you can reflect on that a little bit more, theorize marginality in relation to political economic power a bit more, right? Because obviously in this case it's particularly interesting, right? And may also, of course, very much relate to the broader discussions about the Karoo, right? Which we were all also having last week. But here, in particularly, you stress, for example, the super luxury element of the nature reserves that have been growing over the last decades, and so there is the different angles in relation to the space allow you to either highlight its marginality and/or through the marginality its centrality to certain types of political economies. And this dialectic between centrality and marginality, I find really intriguing. I think that can be theorized and emphasized a bit more. And I want to ask you to do that in basically 2 ways. First of all, in relation to the political economy of water, nature conservation, etc., because there are some interesting tensions there. But second, and more importantly, perhaps, in relation to the question of naturalizing inequality, right? So the idea that this is a marginal space, that this is outside, and hence also wilderness, right? That you can enjoy, but it's so easy to get to. On the other hand, right? This is part of the commercialization of the area, right? It's only a couple hours drive from Pretoria, blah 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 blah, right? So it's actually central, but also far away. How does that dialectic between centrality and marginality of the Waterberg actually relate to or further enable these processes of naturalizing inequality? So, can you say a bit more about that? The second is Medupi. So Medupi has come online, over last years, slowly but surely, in different stages, etc. And I was kind of curious, maybe for an update, right? So I don't know whether you have read up on sort of current developments in relation to Medupi, right? I mean, this is the 6th or 7th or 8th largest coal-fired power plant in the world. To a good degree, if I understand it correctly from what I've read on the internet, it's come on, it's come online, yet we have power outages due to all kinds of other reasons as well. But what I'm particularly interested in is sort of more the historical institutional aspects of how Medupi has complicated and changed the political economy of water in the Waterberg. Namely, that we have this enormous monstrosity that has now been built, that now needs to be churning through coal in order to generate electricity for at least 30, 40 years to get the investment out of it. And yet, right, we just had the COP26, where it said we need to, South Africa needs to get off of coal massively. So all these debates, right? And I'm just asking you to speculate a little bit. All these debates, right? Again, they are so directly related to the debates around the Karoo as well, of course. How do you think that they will again change this political economy? Because I mean, from your book, the conclusion in that chapter, right, chapter 6, if I'm correct, actually says this is pretty straightforward, right? It just adds to the straightforward dynamics. But now the situation changes again, and it's not straightforward what that will do, right? So can you maybe speculate what you see will happen when the climate change pressures on South Africa will much further increase, and Medupi maybe has to go down, but still has rights to water or whatever that has been built up, etc. I'm just curious for an update here. Lastly, one aspect, and that relates directly to our research in Hoedspruit that I've done with Lerato Tagodi and with Tasha Coate, both of whom, of course, you know very well. To get a little bit more into sort of the legal nuances behind greening inequality, naturalizing inequality in relation to the conservation sector, right? So one of the things that we found in Hoedspruit are, and this is something I hadn't really thought about too much before, but incredible legal complexity regarding racialized ownership structures, right? So it's not just that these are farms owned by whites to exploit a certain form of nature conservation for the wealthy, which of course they are too. But one of the things that we see happening, have seen happening in and around Hoedspruit, is that different share blocks, share structures are now being sold in these wildlife properties and in these reserves to make the ownership structures so much more complex, but also diffused. And it means that so many more people can actually buy into this in a way that we argue further cements spatial injustice into place. It makes it so much harder to confront the situation when the legal ownership structures start becoming much more complex, right? It's not just one landowner, but actually so many more share blocks and shareholders, literally, that you now have to deal with. I mean, so my question is quite simple. Have you seen some of this in the Waterberg as well? Right? Have you seen how do these ownership structures develop, and how do they become more complex in relation to the situation both of capitalist pressure on these spaces and but also in relation to potential threats to these these ownership structures? And so I'd be keen to hear what you make of that. I will leave it at that, Cheryl. Thank you so much.
I think you've given several seminars worth of questions and comments, and Michela, you're free to pick and choose, as I was told at a recent conference as well. But those are great questions, and they do open up. So I'm not going to take comment on that now, but move over to Stephen, who might also want to reflect on some of this, but add some additional issues for the discussion. But thanks very much. And just before I move to Stephen, if I may, in case I forget to do this, just to also acknowledge Matthew Wingfield, who is the PhD student in the department, but is also acting as the technical support and doing a wonderful job under trying circumstances. So just to acknowledge him with thanks. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. And this is great to have a book launch despite all these technological, virological, and other challenges. So fantastic. And we're persevering, and it's already, I mean, it's already raised so many important issues. So thank you, Michela, for a fantastic book. I too have my hard copy, and I've many marks in the book, which I will go back to. There was a lot to absorb, and it is written extremely well. And this combination of complexity, clear analysis, and a really well written book. And you know, I think Bron's already referred to that. He's lived with this project much longer than I have, and he still appreciates this massive shift from the PhD to the book, what that entails. So I think this is a prototype for anybody doing their PhD now. It really was insightful, and it was a very nice read. So thank you. So I'm going to read just so that, as I said, I'm still processing. So the way I'm processing is by reading, and I apologize if others out there have read the book already, and if I'm covering territory that's very familiar. So the book starts with the observation that water access in South Africa remains highly unequal despite redistributed water, including the provision of free basic water and a number of other attempts to shift the inequalities in water access. The challenge that Michela poses is to show how and why this inequality persists, and how and why it is normalized and naturalized. Focusing on the Waterberg Plateau in Limpopo province, the key argument in the book is that these extreme forms of inequality are continually reproduced and legitimized through the neoliberal biopolitics of water, through which water provision for urban and rural is focused largely on mere biological survival, not progressive improvement of access. So that's the biopolitics argument. Meanwhile, by means of what she calls a water-land nexus or land-water nexus, white landowners have managed to retain control over vast amounts of water because the post-apartheid state continues to prioritize the use of water for productive purposes. And the ideology produced by the landowners so propels that way of seeing water through a productivist logic or framing. This inequality water is also legitimized in terms of green or conservation aims, or what Michela refers to as green neoliberalism. In terms of this green rhetoric, the South African state is committed to supporting the efficient allocation and use of water that will conserve the resource quantity and quality in the context of climate change. Early on in the book, Michela illustrates an aspect of this with reference to the drought in Cape Town from 2015 to 2019. A drought that visibilized or revealed inequalities in access to water in quite stark ways. And as most of you will know, during day zero, it became clear that the middle classes and the affluent were able to buy themselves out of the crisis by sinking boreholes and wells and by buying water storage tanks. Meanwhile, the urban poor in informal settlements and townships experienced the day zero crisis as yet another ordinary crisis, a chronic crisis of water scarcity that unfolds as part of the everyday realities in ordinary times. Meanwhile, the middle classes and the affluent continue to water their lawns, or continue now to water their lawns, wash their cars, and use vast amounts of water for washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. Because they can afford to pay for this water, there are no limits, seemingly. For the poor, however, their limited financial resources means that they have to queue up to collect water in buckets and communal taps, whether in Falwater, or in Cape Town. In other words, they have to live in a constant state of water scarcity. This is what Michela refers to as ordinary crisis, or what others have called slow violence and chronic crisis. Michela shows in detailed and systematic analyses how these racialized histories of unequal access to water are currently playing out in the Waterberg. She also shows us how these ongoing inequalities are naturalized by a variety of means, including water commodification, and calls for the poor to consume less by becoming responsible consumers who use water efficiently and sparingly. The book also shows how in rural areas ownership of water is closely connected to access to land. And this is what Michela refers to as the land-water nexus that reproduces these inequalities in water access. So here, land rights equal water rights, despite the fact that water reforms after apartheid sought to separate the two in the name of equity and distributive justice, such as intervention with ownership in particular. So you may own the land, but you do not own the water in de jure terms. The state has reinforced this inequality through processes of commodification of water that end up reproducing white control over the majority of the country's water resources. And by making these water services unaffordable to the vast majority of Black South Africans, the case shows how this has taken place through the state's role of regulating the distribution of water rights or licenses by incorporating the provision of a minimal amount of water through social policies such as the free basic water policy. Meanwhile, as was mentioned earlier, the commodification of water continues, as does increasing tariffs, and this becomes a way of getting citizens to think about water in strictly economic terms and to regard this as natural. In the context of ongoing and future droughts, this creates the conditions for normalizing ideas that water will become more and more expensive, and people, especially the poor, must use less of the resources and pay for it as well. Unless, of course, that in vast quantities of waters, like the landowners in the Waterberg Plateau. So the book makes a powerful argument that the post-apartheid state is largely responsible for the situation whereby marginalized surplus populations, people, perhaps ex-farm workers who are now living adjacent to these properties in townships and informal settlements, happening where they live with precarious and minimal water. Michela, together with Bram, in a publication which I brought everything with me, Liquid Violence, which I read a while ago, and that really got me interested in work. And in that article, the concept of liquid violence is used to shift the perspective of studies on the pervasive violence of service delivery protests in poor communities in South Africa. Rather than focusing on the violence of these community-based protests, Michela and Bram seek to explain the structural inequality as a form of violence itself. This is done by showing how liquid violence results in marginalized citizens having to survive without reliable access to water and other resources. Neoliberal ideas about individual responsibilization are seen to result in a situation whereby the poor are compelled to accept that they have no option other than to pay for public water services. In the book, Michela further develops this by showing how the boundaries between the private and public spheres are redrawn in order to transform the provision of public water services into forms of market exchange, thereby entrenching the power of large landowners who have property rights in land and which are treated as if their property rights in land and water. This argument is developed through detailed and systematic accounts from the Waterberg, and it illustrates further, and this runs throughout the book, this idea how these inequalities are naturalized and normalized. Okay, in her account of the history of the land-water nexus in Waterberg, Michela notes that since the 1980s, landowners there have shifted land use from, largely, not all of them, but many, from commercial agriculture, from cattle and crops, to private game farms and private nature reserves. And this has produced new forms of wildlife-based production, hunting, ecotourism, game breeding, and so on. And in this case, access to water is not only based on land ownership, but also this rebooted rhetoric of, or reconfigured rhetoric of conservation. The idea that these game farms and nature reserves use the natural resources in sustainable ways that are especially necessary in this age of climate change. For Michela, these conservation discourses, in other words, have morphed into a form of green neoliberalism that reproduces these historical inequalities. The conception of green neoliberalism also intersects in interesting ways with the work of Leslie Green, who writes about green whiteness. So it's a critique of maybe bourgeois environmentalism or the implication of race and racism in these new discourses. And interestingly, both Michela and Leslie Green analyze rhino poaching in ways that reveal a pernicious politics of race and flag. Michela suggests that the so-called war against rhino poaching in the Waterberg is primarily concerned with rural safety and white fears about violent crime that ignore incidents of abuse and assault of black workers by white farmers. She also notes that the war against rhino poaching has legitimized a further securitization of the Waterberg Plateau, and it now includes armed or intensification of armed patrols, roadblocks, and closures that are aimed at potential poachers, usually described, however, as young black males. Taylor also examines how landowners in the Waterberg insist that they deserve access to these vast quantities of water because they are using the land productively and contributing to the economy. Much like in the past, commercial livestock and crop farmers who justify their access to the land by insisting that they are feeding the nation and ensuring food security. However, what is obscured in these discourses and what becomes clear in the book is the fact that the land upon which commercial agriculture, game farms, and reserves are located are themselves implicated in these violent histories of forced removals by black people, and this continues in another form during apartheid, and that is laid out. So Michela shows how evictions from commercial farms have in fact intensified in the post-apartheid period as a result of increased mechanization, agricultural labor law reforms, and labor shedding that has resulted from the shift to game farming and establishment of nature reserves. These evictions allow farmers and landowners to distance themselves from any responsibility for ex-workers, ex-farm workers who now live in impoverished nearby townships and informal settlements. In fact, Waterberg landowners are able to benefit from selling water to the municipalities who are responsible for providing water to these marginalized communities. So Michela shows us how this once again reproduces this neoliberal biopolitics of water, whereby communities have to endure daily scarcity as a result of inadequate state provision of water, and that water is in any case aimed at mere biological survival, not improving access to water, conforming to what Peter Redfield has written about in his writing about humanitarianism and minimalist biopolitics. I am, but I took a lot of time to write this, and I'm very attached to this, but I will do my best. Okay, so I think the work is really interesting because it also engages with these critiques of neoliberalism by Patrick Bond and James Ferguson, but I think you, perhaps more like James Ferguson, go well beyond formulaic critiques of neoliberalism. And because I have to move on, I can't sort of elaborate why I think that. But now I get to what I would suggest as possibilities for future discussions. I find I would be interested in how your work relates to conceptual and empirically-based studies on neoliberalism and water politics in other parts of the world. So I'm thinking here of Andrea Waterberg's work on, what Italian water activists and how they challenge what they call neoliberal authoritarianism. So it will be interesting to have a comparative study between Italy and South Africa.
It's a project for next year.
Exactly. So Waterberg engages with these worldwide developments in water policies and popular politics, including ongoing resistance to water privatization by social movements and ordinary citizens. Her account opposes the financialization of water infrastructures and services in Italy, and may provide insights into the South African situation. Okay, what are we seeing here? And what are boycotts of paying for services or inability to pay for services reflecting about how people engage with water commodification, neoliberal logics, and cost recovery measures? And now I really am moving towards the end. I apologize for taking so long. But I'm not going to mention anything about Antina von Schlitz's democracy's infrastructure, except to say that you referred to it, and I think you're all engaging with these questions of neoliberal biopolitics of water in interesting ways. And I'd perhaps ask my question about how would you elaborate what the responses of people are to this? Tina von Schlitzl tends to focus on anti-privatization activists who overtly challenge self-consciously challenge these neoliberal logics of responsibilized consumerism through the meter and through other pedagogical interventions to try and get people to pay for water. Now, finally, two questions, and then I will hand over. I'm interested in your ideas about the impact of long-term drought and climate change in a context where people in rural areas and cities have to rely on multiple types of water bodies, not just water that comes out of the tap, but a future scenario in a contemporary situation where climate change dries up rivers, streams, springs, waterholes, aquifers, and this impacts upon the urban and rural world, particularly in terms of everyday existence, where people may rely on that to supplement the very meager water sources they can get. Secondly, and finally, what are the environmental implications of the current policy of separating land and water rights? While one can certainly understand and sympathize with the rationale underpinning the legal separation in order to facilitate equity and redistributive water reforms, what is the impact of this separation at the level of ontology, epistemology, and the environment? And this comes from our discussion with Lauren Muller, in fact, who is working on a lot of this. She uses the concept of water landscapes. And so it's about saying there are real sorts of problems with that legal, one understands the logic of the legal separation in this context, but it can also facilitate the abstraction, standardization, and extraction of water. Similarly, environmentally, what happens if land is not well managed, contaminated by fertilizer, pesticides, or fracking? This clearly impacts directly on underground water. The two are totally intertwined again. How did you know that was my boss?
I saw it again. Stephen, thank you. And thank you to Rob. It's just, there's so much has been raised, and I think it is testament to yes, and how many issues and how they come together. I mean, I think the question of the land-water nexus is obviously essential, but also Graham's question and Michela does, the land-water energy nexus is also really fascinating and important. So I'm going to give Michela, you can just pick and choose, really, just a few responses, and some of this might come up in the questions again. And then Matthew's going to help me field the questions because I'm not at a computer. I write directly. But if you have any, maybe you can also signal in the chat to Matthew so he can pick them up. But Michela, some responses from your side.
It's not really, it's not definitive responses, right? It's just maybe reactions. But what you was saying about centrality and marginality, I remember it was, we discussed that before, right? And I don't really, I still don't really address that, I suppose, in the book. But it's become very, very relevant also, very to the point also in the context of the Peru, absolutely. And I would say also, I want to add maybe also another element, another dimension to that dialectics, which is also about the idea of rurality and rural space. I don't know, that's something that goes on in my mind, but because of the marginalization of rural space and what makes, I don't know, but just my feeling and also thinking in terms of the Karoo is that definitely they are central from a materialist perspective, perhaps the material resources to support certain political economic processes are there, right? And it would be the wildlife, the nature, but also the coal, etc. And the water resources, right? Because the water resources also that go to Medupi come from there. But at the same time, why is that so easy to marginalize the space, to construct them as places that what happens there doesn't really matter to the larger public opinion? How is it easy to erase them? Quite literally, as in the case of Medupi, right? So the water resources of the waterbed can go to Medupi by literally erasing what's happening in Falmata from the study documents around that. I'm not sure if they are still there. There's a...
Oh, that's fine. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Did everybody still hear Michela? All good?
Okay.
Well, continue.
Okay, good.
I can still hear you.
You can. Okay, thanks. So not a response really, but just to recognize, I think it's a very useful, important point. It's something that we need to think in. It might be also felt in comparative perspectives with a Karoo. I don't know, but thank you for that. And just quickly, I can't really, I don't know if I can speculate on the future of Medupi, but just because of the phrasing of the COP26 agreement, this phase down, right, is the final. So I'm not really sure. Well, we'll see what happens, but I don't think it will go away anytime soon. And I mean, those, if history is, yeah, in terms of where the water resources are going to be allocated afterwards, how that is going to change. I'm not really optimistic that there's going to be a change. I mean, they were with the minerals energy complex for many years since the 1980s. They're still with them. So, yeah, I don't know if especially if water rights will be reallocated to some other sectors, even if Medupi has to close sooner rather than later. And because I'm cherry picking, I thank you also, Stephen, for your questions. And again, Antina's work, for instance, when you refer to that, is very, I use that quite a lot. I suppose you can see the difference there that I'm not an anthropologist, right? And what she is, and I don't do what she does. And so in that sense, I haven't, I suppose, also paid much attention to the responses of local people to this inequality, but also because there weren't many, I don't want to overlook the responses, but in a sense, you really see that absence of protest, of other forms of engagement with the water issue. So that's
in that context,
in the water context, so which makes it more difficult, of course, to engage with and to study. Yeah, maybe just one point that was not one of the questions you made, you asked at the end, but just maybe to stress, you do say that I do talk about the post-apartheid state being responsible, right, for the crisis, which I agree with you. I try to do that, but I also think it's important, also in relation to some comments that were made also last week at the Karoo conference, for those who are there. It's the post-apartheid state, but it's not the local government. So how to, or not just that, right? How to differentiate and to make that explanation about lack of capacity and municipal failures, dysfunctionalities, a bit more complex and more nuanced. Or something.
Thank you. That's an interesting point. Thank you. So we've got about 20 minutes. So maybe, as we normally do, take 3 questions or comments. And I'm going to ask for Matthew's help with that. If you could just briefly introduce yourselves, just say who you are, and Matthew, can you help me with?
Sure. So we have a question in the chat by Mzi, so I'll read it. My question, and I'm sure this comes after a lot of praise, but my question, your argument is based on the commodification of water as a resource and the racialization of access to water thereof because of the history and neoliberalism, which is correct. So I'm wondering, have you thought about the weakening of state institutions or how the weakening of state institutions has contributed to poor access of water? For example, the collapsing municipalities, which obviously you just noted, have also increasingly derailed water access for those in the townships. What do you think? And we'll wait for, there's a hand. Shahid, go ahead.
Shahid, if you could just introduce yourself briefly and pose your question.
Yeah, sure. Hi guys. My name is Dr. Shahid Tayyab. I think I know most of you except Bram. So I'm a colleague in the department. Thanks for the discussion. So I haven't got to read the book, obviously. Well, not obviously, but I didn't get to read the book. But I thought the talks were really fascinating. I just wanted to. It alerted me to something. I was wondering. The racialization of access to land and water is quite obvious in South Africa, even though people are scared to talk about it for some reason. So I'm glad that you're actually writing about it. I wanted to make a comment that actually it's interesting that it's foreign researchers that often are the ones that come here and call a spade, right? And that's something that we need to actually address. What is it about the academy in South Africa that it's constantly running away from this? But anyway, my question to Michela, and we know the answer, I'm just putting it there, right? So my question to Michela is, I'm following only from the conversations, the question of the post-apartheid state. So on the one hand, given the fact, right, that we constantly, when people do solid research, we find these very interesting continuities in the way practice works, all the way down, all the way down. It's not even just like, so what is the status of the post? And what is the post doing, in the way that we keep on employing this question of the state? It relates to my second argument, because the question of obviously pre and post is boring, right? But the real question is, what is the question of the state, right? What is if the state, if we follow certain theorizations of the state is, in classical European theory, for example, some a kind of fiction, right? But it has a monopoly on violence, for example, right? A monopoly on certain kinds of action. And in your experience, because you're working in these kind of areas, I'm wondering, have you reflected on what is the relation of the state in this kind of situation? Would you have a minority settler community, right, who continues to draw a lot of, a lot of power, of course, in very interesting and complicated ways, as you say. And of course, the comparison, I suppose, would be the United States, right? But you also have we also have a settler colonial state, but it's a majority settler colonial state, where the state works with the majority. And so I think this is just something that came up for me, in hearing these talks. Like, what are we talking about when we evoke this idea of the state in South Africa? When the state is working on behalf, in the way you show, actually a settler colonial population, right, that continues to claim the monopoly on resources and policy. And that, so that is just a general question I think is very important coming out of your work. And obviously, we have to think about it more. So thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to reading it.
Thanks. And is there a third hand? Not yet. Okay. So, Michela, the way there's some
confusion. Yeah, it's about the state
also the earlier comments. So,
yeah. So I don't really, I'm afraid I don't really theorize the state so much in the book. So it's not really a question I engage that much in empirical terms. But I suppose what I try to do is to show that, as I said before, it's not just about the collapsing municipality as one aspect of the state as local government. So that also to answer to the question, even if you had, now it's not that this is a particularly success story of a municipality, right? I mean, the work issues and stuff. But my sense and my argument would be, even if you had the most efficient municipality in the world or in South Africa, then still negotiating and navigating these power relations around water with farmers, with landowners, would make still impossible to get access to water, right? I mean, that was very much clear. It's not that because they were incompetent, it was just that the differential in terms of power relations and what could they do in terms of access to water it was just making things, frankly, almost impossible for the municipality to do something. Which is then also about what is the role of the state, but also, I suppose, what is the role of the different tiers of government in relation to water in South Africa? That's also an important question. So what can we expect from municipalities? What can they do, even though they are officially, formally, water services authority and providers? But what can they actually do, especially in these situations where that power, those power dynamics are so, again, striking, are so extreme in a sense. And what is the role of provincial government, national government? What I try to do, maybe the state does not come up so much in relation to, well, it does come up in relation to local government, but it's also a reflection about the empowerment, the dysfunctional, of course, but also not really trying so much redistributing water, using its powers to do that, to also assist the municipalities to get access to water. So it's I think yes, it's absolutely an important question to ask. What is the state doing here, and why it is not redistributing water more specifically? Why it is not doing that to indeed meet the needs and the requests of also the people they represent and the majority of the local population. So maybe I'll start with that. And if I can just maybe just add, it was a comment, the first comment you made, Reid, about being foreigner, right, and being alert to these things. I suppose I should also clarify that one of the reasons I became also so interested in this issue in the water and in relation to also to race is because of the presence of many foreigners, right, that are buying land in the area. So it was also, it's not just me pointing the finger to South African people having still not knowing how to deal with race and stuff, but it's how white foreigners coming into the country, getting control over land and water, and then reproducing these racial relations without one bit of consideration about that and how.
Particularly in the conservation sector?
Particularly, but not necessarily, I would say, but still buying into that dream of the water as there's a wilderness and yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we've got time for another round of questions or comments. Matthew, are there? Maybe I can pick up on one, and it relates to, well, you were Minister of Water Affairs, and you'd have to have more power than that, I would think. But no, it's around the question of scarcity and how we conceptualize scarcity and South Africa, because I will hold on to the fact that South Africa is a water scarce place, and that we do need to think about that and redistribution. But you might want to comment on that.
Oh yeah,
comment with mine. But nevertheless, it's not a rainfall, particularly in the areas where we're currently, it's not a high rainfall area, etc. So, so how we think about the question of scarcity and how we think about it, but also then in terms of the different demands on the state, in this case, as trying to regulate the commons, water as a commons. But I mean, how do you work that? What are the how do you mediate those different constituencies, and what would a more just water policy look like?
Okay. I'm not, I suppose, that's like issues of sustainable development. I'm not comfortable. I suppose I wouldn't say actually that South Africa is a water scarce country because of the extension and the different climates that you have. So what does it mean that South Africa is a water scarce country when you have such different also climatic zones in it? Does an average really, using an average as water scarcity indices, does it really make sense, or isn't it, I don't know, a bit of a, is it accurate enough? I don't know. So I'm always a bit hesitant, let's say, to repeat that, because it has been used as a very powerful claim, right? To say that because water is a water scarce country, therefore we need to implement X and Y, etc. Also, when you say that water is a commons, I have some questions about that too. Is it water commons in this country? I mean, the National Water Act is very ambivalent also on that. So it is, but it's also not. So, but well, luckily I'm not the Minister of Water and Sanitation. But I would, the idea of like, how do you find? I would definitely proceed with redistribution. I'm not. In that case, I'm not hesitant, right, to argue, to advocate for water redistribution, and to change completely also the free basic water policy, so that it's not just the minimum, but it's we agree on a common, right, not just for the poor, but common decent standards of water access that applies to everyone. And anything below that, we become, indignant. Like what Ron was saying in the beginning, we get there's the element of indignation about that. So, yeah. But then, of course, it becomes tricky in the context of neoliberalism, of course. So the structures that, and they define, and that's also what I suppose I do in the book, and in some point, but maybe also at the end in the conclusion, it's just to be reminded that the way equality is being conceptualized now in South Africa in relation to water is a very narrow minimum right definition, which is compatible with the commodification of services and resources, but it's far from just.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I'm looking to Matthew to help. There was
yes, there is. Thomas. Thomas, you had your hand up. Thomas Werman.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please just briefly introduce yourself and go ahead.
Hello, my name is Thomas Omen. I was in South Africa a couple of years ago conducting research for my thesis regarding Day Zero and the water crisis. So I find this book launching or book discussion quite interesting. I'm currently writing an article about the crisis and the findings of my research. So everything that's being said, everything that's being discussed is highly usable and very valuable. I was just, there's a lot of things I would like to ask, but I'm just going to be quite brief. The first one is, I just wanted to, given the existing tendencies and perhaps, I don't know if I can call them tensions that exist in the water governance systems in South Africa, such as, for example, in cities looking for fiscal solvency, water redistribution goals, and sustainability. How can these, my question would be, how can these goals actually be sustained? So looking for equality, looking for fiscal solvency and sustainability. I think Cape Town showed the case in which the crisis was not only one of scarcity or that there was no water, but also that the city was running out of money based on their commercialization or commodification of water politics that run how water is serviced. So maybe you can help me out on that question.
Right. Well, I suppose I would go back to that, what I was saying before, in terms of like, how do you bring other spheres of government into the picture, into the discussion, so that municipalities don't have to survive on the revenues that come from services that clearly the majority of people cannot afford. That is unsustainable. So what is the role then of the department, again, the fiscus, in terms of and transfers, but also the very idea of fiscal sustainability and solvency, this compartmentalization, corporatization of the municipality. I think it's part of the problem, and one can actually rethink that and making it a bit more unnatural than it is currently, right? That's the norm, and so yeah, maybe just that.
Thanks. And can I follow up with another question, perhaps?
Please,
well, during my research, something that I found and was quite interesting was that amidst the crisis, different citizens in different parts of the city were basically taking the issues into their own hands, solving their water problems in different ways. So we would have more affluent areas where white South Africans commonly live, going off the grid with, I don't know, for example, having their own filtration systems and exploiting groundwater, for example, whilst poorer settlements in South Africa were going for communal wells more often because they couldn't afford water, and they were having water measuring devices put there. So I'm just curious, to what extent has citizenship or hydraulic citizenship been redefined in South Africa? Is it constantly being redefined through these practices, and why are some allowed and some not, for example?
That's really Antina's book. Are we lost?
No, all good. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I thought you.
Sorry.
So, do you know Antina van Schleet's book? The Democracy's Infrastructure.
Yeah, not the book, the article.
Okay,
I read some articles.
That became a book, and that engages precisely with that question and with issues of citizenship. So I would, I don't do that much. I don't really go into, but it's, I suppose, is that idea of, at least in the case I have studied, right, is that idea of like, indeed, it's all about the individual responsibility of citizens that matters, and it is made to matter, and that usually translates into individual fiscal ability and responsibility. So indeed, if you have, as you were saying, if you have the financial means to drill a borehole, to buy a water tank, etc., you can find these individual solutions to the problem. But it's very much, again, it's left to the individual sphere to deal with these issues, and it's not really and then a very form of individualized citizenship in the country. Actually, citizenship is a more common notion. No, that's a bit crumbling less. But please get the book. That's really about that.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course, Matthew. You can ask a question.
So yeah, thank you very much, Michela. It's very interesting. A lot of the work on Andrea Ballesteros, thinking specifically on the future history of water, and she talks quite interestingly about this, how activists and people on the ground, people involved in water monitoring, negotiate this line of water being a commodity, commodity or commodification of water, and then it being sort of a public good, and like you talked about the discursive conversation around water commons and it being a right for everyone versus the commodification of water. So have there been any community responses regarding this, or is it so the logic so pervasive of this is it's followed on from histories of inequality in the area that communities take this for granted, or have there been community responses that I'm sure Pauline, Gordon, who's master's student in Anthropology, can talk more about scarcity and demand.
So I think, given that we are at 2:30, that will be the last question, but I'm sure Michela is available to engage further with people as well. But Michela, would you like to respond to that? And also any closing comments that you would like to make?
No, well, it's no, again, not strong current as opposed to maybe more invisible forms of response and resistance and engagement on the part of the community, right? Not even many or significant protest, right? And I think what I try to also in a few points to say is that might have, it was not the main thing about my work, right? Because it was not this very apparent, clear research object to look at. But it might really have something to do with the history of the place and who are these people, where do they come from, and the history of exploitation and oppression on farms, right? So ex-farm workers, descendants of farm workers, and also how their history of resistance has played out in the past in the country. But yes, I'll stop there. And oh, I don't really know. It's not a very big thank you for everything.
Well, thank you, Michela. I mean, you've provoked, obviously, in your presentation, for those who haven't read the book, a lot of issues as well. We hope that everybody will now get an opportunity to read the book. But you raised so many issues in the book, which we also were seeing in the inputs from our two panelists. So I think it's been a very productive conversation. Obviously, we could continue on these themes for much longer, and maybe there will be some other opportunities to go back to them, thinking about the seminar program next year. And maybe you can come and talk to us about comparative perspectives when you are back in Italy.
Yes, exactly.
But just to thank you, particularly to congratulate you again. It is a wonderful achievement. It's great. There's the book. There's the author. And thank you to the two panelists, Rob and Stephen. It's been great having you as part of this discussion. And then thank you to those of you online. We're sorry we weren't all in the room together. And unfortunately, we had some technical problems, but I think we've had a very, very rich engagement. So thank you to everybody. And we will see you at the next seminar, which I think will be in 2022.
2022.
2022. So thank you, everybody, and go well.
Thanks all. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Michela.
Thank you.